And we go on to our next item on the agenda, the Commission's statement on the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia. Therefore, I would like to ask Ms. Urpilainen again to take the floor.
Dear President, honourable members, 3 months into the conflict in Tigray, the EU is still extremely concerned by the situation in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an important EU partner in the Horn of Africa, and Ethiopia is one of the few countries with whom the EU has a strategic engagement. Our decision to postpone the disbursement of 3 budget support payments for a total amount of 88.5 million euros must be seen in that context, where we are asking for a cease of hostilities, unhindered humanitarian access, and an investigation of reported human rights abuses. As time passes by, let me be clear, colleagues. The humanitarian situation is getting dangerously critical. The newly established administration in Tigray stated mid-January that over 4.5 million people were in need of emergency food assistance, of whom 2.2 million were internally displaced persons with other basic needs. Most of Tigray is now classified as crisis in the food security classification, which is one step before famine, and the health system has collapsed in many places. This requires immediate scale-up of assistance, with large-scale full distributions and provision of primary healthcare services. An increase of additional experienced emergency staff is urgently needed. On Monday, together with the High Representative Borrell and Commissioner Lenarchis, we have issued a statement calling for immediate strengthening of actions. First, 2 months after the signature of the UN and Government of Ethiopia access agreement, aid actors are still without meaningful access to most of Tigray. We take note of the engagement by the Government of Ethiopia to review urgently requests submitted by humanitarian partners, but more improvement on humanitarian access is needed. Relief actors, including large UN agencies such as World Food Programme or UNHCR, need to be able to operate directly and not only via or in support of the Ethiopian administration. Second, the protection of civilians caught in the Tigray conflict is at the heart of our preoccupations, with increasing reports of ethnic violence, casualties and serious violations of human rights, international refugee and humanitarian law, including appalling levels of sexual and gender-based violence. The EU continues supporting refugees, IDPs and host communities through the implementation of programmes financed by the EU Trust Fund for Africa. And in addition, the EU supports poorest food insecure households through the Productive Safety Net programme with a contribution of 50 million euros. The EU has called for the prevention of refoulement and forced return targeting Eritrean refugees. It has underlined that all civilians in search of assistance, safety and security in Tigray should be safe and free to move to other Ethiopian regions or towards neighbouring countries. We are, in that light, very much concerned about the situation at the border with Sudan, and as a result, the EU has been allocating additional funds, 70 million euros, to the Sudan Family Support Programme to support the government of Sudan hosting Ethiopian refugees. Last but not least, the Finnish Foreign Minister, Pekka Haavisto, is leading this week a high-level EU-mandated mission to Sudan and Ethiopia, notably to discuss humanitarian access with Ethiopian authorities. And of course, we are looking forward to working with him and of course with this House to take the recommendations forward.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Hölényi on behalf of the European People's Party, joining us from Budapest. Madam President, Madam Commissioner, honourable members, the armed conflict in the Tigray region in Ethiopia has led to a dire situation for 4.5 million people. Despite the demands of the UNHCR, access for emergency aid services is very limited. Latest news tell us that a high number of NGOs have been able to return to the region, but these are not. These are only the latest news. We haven't got any proof for this. In November 2019, I had the opportunity to visit this very region. Also visited the two camps in the Tigray region, and I could see it with my own eyes, the situation of the internally displaced persons. The North Tigray federal state is in a very difficult situation. Most people have no access to food, electricity or fuel. We are talking about over 2 million internally displaced persons. The Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, who received the Nobel Peace Prize just over a year ago, ordered the armed forces to intervene in this region. Unfortunately, this goes against national and regional stability and peace. This is not a domestic issue. The Tigray conflict is a risk to the entire region's stability. Almost 6 million people have arrived in neighboring countries. We must end the armed conflict as soon as possible. Otherwise, the conflict could spread to the other countries and send more migrants towards Europe.
Thank you. The next speaker is from the S&D Group, Maria Arena.
Madam President, Commissioner, against a backdrop of political tensions between Mr. Ahmed Abiy's government and the TPLF, which we shouldn't forget dominated the political stage in Ethiopia for decades and itself was also responsible for serious human rights infringements. We can see now this humanitarian disaster, as you've said, Madam Commissioner. The Human Rights Watch report is very depressing. How can Mr. Abiy's government justify military operations plunging thousands of civilians into disarray, massive destruction of infrastructure, public infrastructure such as schools and hospitals, impossibility of physical access, closing down internet? Thousands of people have had to flee to seek refuge in Sudan to avoid attacks. Others are internally displaced, and in the worst cases, some families are stranded with no access to food, water or medicine. Madam Commissioner, you have said it. urgent humanitarian access is important and, as you said, urgent, but also respect to the rules, because the law of armed conflict in Tigray prevents any attack targeting civilians or civilian structures. Any indiscriminate attack, any attack causing more harm to civilians rather than military gains, that's prohibited. Any individual infringing these rules of law on a deliberate basis is responsible for war crimes and should be brought to justice. This is a very important message that needs to be conveyed to Mr. Abiy from Ethiopia's government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, on behalf of the Renew Group, I give the floor to Mr. Ötchen.
Thank you, Madam President. What we are seeing unfold in Tigray is a terrible humanitarian crisis. The numbers are staggering. 4.5 million persons are in need of humanitarian assistance. 10,000 are at severe risk of starvation. Hundreds of thousands of refugees are caught in the crossfire. 58,000 refugees have fled to nearby Sudan, and there are reports of atrocities against thousands of civilians. Ladies and gentlemen, after 3 months, Ethiopia ended its military operation, but the aftershock will be felt for years to come, and not only in Ethiopia, ladies and gentlemen. Already before the military skirmish, Tigray was a host region of hundreds of thousands of refugees spread over 4 camps, with millions who were already in need of humanitarian assistance. You already mentioned this, Madam Commissioner. And this conflict has only exacerbated the situation. Already before the military skirmish, the Horn of Africa was known as a delicate region. Now this conflict risks spilling over into neighboring countries and destabilize the entire region. The exact numbers of those in humanitarian need remains difficult to predict, because promises to restore communications have not been fully met. Humanitarian aid workers and organisations are still denied access to Tigray, cutting off millions from aid. Unverified reports of atrocities and impunity are rampant, and there are conflict reports of foreign interference by Eritrean troops. Action is needed immediately. Now that millions more require humanitarian assistance, the international community and the federal government must urgently find a peaceful end to this conflict and step up their commitment to the responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. Signing of the Memorandum of Understanding with the United Nations by Prime Minister Abiy was an important first step, but however, key humanitarian aid organisations are still being barred from entering the region, especially in areas on conflict. And I reiterate what you just said, Madam Commissioner, they have to access those people in order to help directly and not only through Ethiopian authorities. It's exactly in these regions that humanitarian aid is needed the most. The federal government must now stick to its commitments. First, accelerate creating unconditional and unhindered access for humanitarian aid workers. Second, establish secure humanitarian corridors. And thirdly, work with humanitarian aid organisations to establish a clear estimate of who is in need of aid. I think that the decision of the Commission to allocate 70 million euros to the Sudanese government is a good decision, because this helps in this situation in this difficult situation. But I agree with you that more improvement is needed. Meine Damen und Herren, die Lage in
The situation in Ethiopia is worsening, and I think now is the time to call upon the Ethiopian government to grant direct access to aid organisations, because people there in the region cannot be supported by the Ethiopian government alone. They need international help, assistance from the international community, and I'm proud that the European Union is using not only strong language, but also putting its hand in its pocket to help with money. And I think that money is very much needed. We've stood back and watched for far too long and let the Ethiopian government continue. Now is the time not to stand and look on, but to have a clear dialogue, making sure that the humanitarian crisis can be reduced.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Catherine Griset from the ID Group.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam Commissioner. Ethiopia is in the news again with the Tigray conflict, and we are perhaps on the brink of an explosion, and we have to make sure that there is not a humanitarian crisis that is added to a migration crisis. We know that many of the migratory routes, there's one that goes through Ethiopia, that goes through Libya, and then reaches Europe. We have to make sure that we see that this doesn't just relate to those from Ethiopia, but the entire Horn of Africa. And this could have an impact on the entire continent of Europe with the displacement of peoples. Ethiopia has an important role to play in the balance in the region, where we can see there are many conflicts that are cascading. There are ethnic war in South Sudan, in a dictatorship, as well as a number of massacres that were carried out by Islamists, including Al-Shabaab. Now, of course, there are also issues related to the water in the Nile that is having a negative impact in Egypt. Now, we know that we shouldn't interfere in domestic affairs in the country, but we need to look at the diplomatic routes that we could take to assist the IDPs. We have to salute what took place 2 years ago when Ethiopia put an end to the conflict with Eritrea. If the central government cannot keep cohesion amongst all of the various peoples that make up the country, this will explode, much like happened in Yugoslavia. Europe has to keep a close eye on the major geopolitical shifts that are taking place there, from Mozambique to the Suez, and to work with regional and international players in the area to achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Az Zöldek képviselőcsoportjában.
Our next speaker is Herzberger Fofana from the Green Group.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues. Since the end of last year, we have looked on with concern at the social and political situation in Ethiopia, but let us just reflect for a moment to move away from recent confrontations and look at the broader context. In other words, a permanent conflict. If you look back at this historically, of course, the Ethiopian government has to shoulder its part of responsibility with respect to the current situation in the country. Nevertheless, we also remember that the European Union had committed to support this government, that had promised to introduce reforms, not primarily based on ethnicity and taking into account gender. Here in the European Parliament, just a few years back, we criticised the infringement of human rights of the party, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, that was in power in Tigray from 91 to 98. Ethiopia is a very important power for the EU and plays an important role in the region. The EU can play a positive role, not in a paternalistic way, but as a partner of Ethiopia. But do we have all the instruments necessary to establish peace in the region? The Commission has decided to suspend or to postpone the budgetary aid to Ethiopia on the basis of events in the Tigray region. Why didn't you invoke Article 96 of the Cotonou Agreement, which sets out a clear procedure in the case of human rights infringement before actually engaging in any measures against Ethiopia? And what is the legal basis of your decision to suspend aid, which is effectively a sanction against the Ethiopian government? It's in our interest to become more sensitive with respect to the complexity of this conflict, to improve the situation of the most vulnerable people, refugees, women and children, and many groups of victims. It's only thus that humanitarian action in the EU will have a sustainable and targeted impact.
Köszönöm szépen.
Thank you very much. Now we have Asita Kanko from the ECR group.
Madam President, dear colleagues, dear Commissioner, thank you very much. The ECR Group strongly condemns the violence in Tigray. We support international calls for swift and unconditional access to the whole region for humanitarian aid, independent human rights monitors and the media. The vast majority of the 6 million inhabitants of Tigray have been without adequate food, water and medicine for weeks. 2 million civilians are reported to have been driven from their homes. In the north, the harvest is said to have been burned. Elsewhere, farmers have abandoned their fields. It seems that the Ethiopian government is deliberately withholding food in order to starve people. Central and East Tigray are on the brink of famine. Recent promises of humanitarian access have been insufficient and uncertain. There are continued reports of violations of international humanitarian law, such as the deliberate shelling of civilian targets, extrajudicial executions and widespread looting. It's also reported that sexual violence is a weapon of war in this conflict. The offensive by the Ethiopian government army against Tigray has rekindled the old conflict with Sudan over the Al-Fashqa border region. And Eritrean troops are also said to be active in Tigray. It should not be forgotten that repression by the federal government is also taking place elsewhere in the country, such as the terror in Oromia, Ethiopia's largest state. The European Union, together with other international partners, must play their part to help end this conflict and reform the Ethiopian state, something supported by its many diverse populations. The Ethiopian Prime Minister should not only give his Nobel Prize back, but also return his country to the principles of peace and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Kanko. And now, Mr. Wallace for 3 minutes.
Thanks, President. I lost my best friend, Pat Whitty, 5 years ago today. I still miss him. People in Tigray are losing whole families these past few months because of the war crimes of Ethiopia's unelected Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. And the government is doing all it can to hide the truth. Ethiopian ambassador to EU, Hirat Zamin, came to our Foreign Affairs Committee 2 weeks ago, and a lot of what she had to say was a work of fiction. She said, "We are restoring the law and order situation. The operation, as you might be aware," she said, "has been concluded within 3 weeks." This is not true. After 13 weeks, fighting continues. She said the Ethiopian government is focused on delivering much anticipated humanitarian assistance. Not true. The Ethiopian government has done everything in its power to prevent humanitarian aid reaching the people of Tigray. Aid agencies have been badly frustrated. She said the Abiy Ahmed government tried its best to take on board the TPLF leadership. Not true. As soon as Abiy became Prime Minister, he set out to isolate the TPLF and the people of Tigray. He dissolved the ruling coalition of which TPLF were part of. Now he's expelled 17,000 Tigray soldiers from the Ethiopian army, and Ethiopia's airline have fired all their workers from Tigray. If Abiy's government had any interest in the truth, it would allow independent UN-led investigations in Tigray and give access to independent media. In total violation of international law, Eritrean troops are in Tigray committing unspeakable atrocities, murdering civilians, looting, destroying public property, factories, hospitals and religious sites. And still Abiy Ahmed denies the presence of Eritrean troops in Tigray. His peace deal with Isaias Afwerki, Eritrea's president, looks more like a war deal now, a vengeful marriage of convenience against the people of Tigray. A government accused of committing war crimes in Tigray, using hunger as a weapon, and one that continues to blatantly lie about the involvement of Eritrean troops in Tigray, cannot be trusted to deliver relief to Tigray. A government that deliberately burned fields of crops in Tigray cannot be trusted with delivering food aid. A government that causes suffering and deaths on its own citizens in a treacherous partnership with Eritrea's president, a ruthless dictator, cannot be trusted with ending the suffering of Tigray. Sadly, too many of the world's powers are content to ignore the slaughter taking place in Tigray. The Americans, the Russians, Saudi, UAE and others are still happy to do deals with this war criminal, Abiy Ahmed, as they scheme to plunder Ethiopia with his help. If Europe stands for anything, let's see some real effort and put an end to the persecution of the people of Tigray. And let's see Abiy Ahmed and Afwerki held to account in the International Criminal Court. Our silence is causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wallace. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Castaldo.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, Commissioner. Following the insurrection in the Tigray region, the number of individuals that currently need humanitarian aid to survive has gone from 1.8 to 2.5 million people. If we add to this the uptick in the locust crisis, we know that there's going to be absolute need for humanitarian aid from the international community. Now, I've seen some positive moves in terms of the UN and the national authorities, and then we see 24 humanitarian operators have been able to work in the area. Now, these are fundamental things to be able to come to a good management of the crisis before it is too late. The context is extremely complex. We have seen that there has been some reform undertaken that we've seen also in terms of the peace agreement that seemed absolutely unthinkable. We need support so that the situation doesn't degenerate, so that these types of efforts are not in vain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castaldo. And now for 2 minutes, Mr. Neusser. Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, colleagues, for 3 months now, we've been seeing war in Ethiopia, civil war in Tigray. Contrary to the assertion of the central government in Addis Ababa, from the end of November last year, the war has not come to an end. It has not been won, nor is there peace. It is a terrible humanitarian catastrophe which the world public has to look at in horror. The health system has collapsed. More and more people in Tigray are dependent on humanitarian aid. The International Red Cross is talking about 80% of the population. It's a civil war which has exacerbated the humanitarian crisis. However, this crisis is really to be seen as a means of war. The government which the leader of the government got the Nobel Prize, quite rightly, for his reconciliation with Eritrea, but now is trampling on reconciliation in his own country. As the EU, we have expressed a clear position. We've frozen budgetary support as long as humanitarian aid does not get into the country and as long as international media is not admitted. We are calling for unlimited access of humanitarian organizations to Tigray and that the 20,000 refugees in Eritrea, that we understand what's happened to them and that troops should be withdrawn from Eritrea, and that the leaders of aid organizations in Tigray, such as the director of REST, who has been arrested, should be released. This would be a sign of reconciliation. It's not a weakness to show reconciliation. Thank you very much, Mr. Neusser. Now for 2 minutes, Mr. Marquardt.
Die Lage ist wirklich schwer.
The situation is unbearable. 5 million in the Tigray region, 4.5 of those dependent on aid, many on the verge of starvation. More than 22,000 dead, many war crimes. Many of those that are in the country have fled. There's obviously a crime against humanity. There are 2 refugee camps that have been completely destroyed. You can see from satellite images. UN has no access to these camps. We don't know where the 22,000 people are. They've disappeared. It's true that it's we need independent clarification. What is the role of Eritrea in the region? The Prime Minister being given money maybe to commit crimes. Who is responsible for these crimes? How can the people responsible be brought to justice? How can we ensure that humanitarian aid is reaching those that need it, and that the press can get in? These are important questions. If the EU is to be successful, then we need a coordinated approach with member states. It would be very difficult to accept if we have the European Commission on the one hand taking measures and then they are undermined by member states, say Germany. So it's important that we work together not only with the Commission but also with Council under leadership of the Council presidency in order to bring about an improvement in the region as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marquardt. And now Mr. Czarnecki for 1 minute.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Madam President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia is a particular country for us. This is the first Christian state in Africa. This is the country described by Ryszard Kapuściński, translated into many languages. This country was for a time an Italian colony with a long and splendid history. So it should come as no surprise that we are interested in what is going on right now in Ethiopia. This country, of course, has changed a lot throughout its history. In the meantime, there was a peace deal with Eritrea. Right now, Eritrea is part of those who intervene and interfere in Ethiopia. Apparently, their militias are also there doing a lot of damage. Our voice needs to be heard. We need to defend those who cannot defend themselves.
Thank you very much, Mr. Czarnecki. And now, Madam Inche, for 1 minute.
Colleagues, Commissioner, almost 3 months or over 3 months have passed since the central government in Ethiopia aggressively marched into Tigray, and the people in Tigray have suffered tremendously since then. It is a shame that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, acts in total contradictions with the spirit of the Peace Prize. He's not worthy the prize when he seems to not even be able to spell to peace. Instead, his actions have led to humanitarian catastrophe in Tigray, and information on what is really going on in the region still remains shut down to a big extent. A couple of weeks ago, we also got alarming information on sexual violence against women and girls being used as a tool of war. That is a war crime. EU and all member states must cut all kinds of support that goes through the Ethiopian central government, channelize it only through other actors so it reaches the people, increase the humanitarian support to the Tigray region, and we must start acting in defence of all women and girls that are having their lives destroyed. An EU feminist policy is more important now than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for 2 minutes, Madam Langensiepen. Colleagues, the perspectives of this dramatic conflict could not be more different. The EU, the UNHCR and the Red Cross are expressing warnings to the Ethiopian government and are calling for support for the 4 million in need. The former ally of the EU is being criticised and they're being called upon to do something about the humanitarian situation. But all of this is grotesque. The war in Tigray hasn't been stopped. There's talk of 60,000 who have had to flee to Sudan. 2 of the camps have been closed, so the safety of the refugees is no longer guaranteed. We need to put an end to the fighting, and we need proper humanitarian access to the region. There are threats for the whole of the Horn of Africa. Premier Abiy Ahmed is considering this conflict as a merely domestic matter that he can control, but it's becoming ever more complex. Eritrean troops are fighting in Tigray, together with the agreement of the Ethiopian government, but without their control. There would be terrible consequences if Tigray were to collapse. The EU call for withdrawal is essential. There are tensions between Sudan and Ethiopia at the border. There have been military incursions and deaths that cannot be tolerated in the future. The EU has to do everything possible to minimize the flow of arms and to mediate here, because further destabilized Ethiopia will completely destroy all the successes of the last years. That's not in the interest of the people there or in the EU, because we have a lot to gain from peace. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Madam Wisniewska, 1 minute.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, the situation in Ethiopia is extremely serious. The results of military action are very scary. Ethiopia needs humanitarian aid now. I think it's good that, taking account of the current situation, the budgetary support from the EU has been suspended. We had no other choice, but the suspension in this flow of money cannot mean the end of humanitarian programs. So we have to make sure that humanitarian aid reaches this country, because we are on the brink of a humanitarian disaster, famine, and also sexual exploitation of women. It's very dramatic, so we should have that in focus. Let's keep in focus also children who are deprived of education, food, and access to healthcare. Ethiopia needs our humanitarian aid.
Thank you very much, Madam Wisniewska. And now for 1 minute, Madam Gonzalez.
Gracias.
Thank you. Colleagues, Madam Commissioner, we are the greatest donor in humanitarian aid, and we are the player with the most power. We also have great responsibility to act in this crisis in Tigray. Now, we ask for more humanitarian aid. When we do that, that is to protect victims of these conflicts that are being faced with famine and climate change. Now, Ethiopia cannot be an exception in this case. We support the suspension of cooperation to bring about pressure on them, but we have to make sure that aid gets to those who need it. Now, we thank the European Union for its efforts to broaden access to humanitarian aid, and we know that the Ethiopian government is throwing up barriers to access to the NGOs as well as UN agencies. We ask for the EU-AU diplomacy to focus on a free, impartial access with neutrality and independency. Now, we know that 9 million people are living off of international aid at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Gonzalez. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Bielan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We cannot continue to ignore the humanitarian crisis and the blatant violation of fundamental rights currently happening in Ethiopia, our partner with the African Union. I note with great concern reports of the limitation to humanitarian access to Tigray that will lead to hundreds of thousands of people starving to death, Eritrean soldiers forcibly returning refugees from Tigray, and killings on political, ethnic and religious grounds in Ethiopia. So today we call on all parties involved in the conflict to respect human rights and refrain from further violence. Effective protection of refugees, including preventing any act of coerced return targeting Eritrean refugees, needs to be ensured. This ongoing conflict will worsen ethnic tensions throughout the country and poses a security threat to the entire Horn of Africa region. The EU and the other relevant external action bodies must urgently address human rights concerns and imminent starvation threats, both bilaterally with Ethiopia and through multilateral platforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bielan. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Yaki.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, President. As one of those who initiated this debate, I was extremely worried when I heard about massacres of Christians in the Tigray region. About 750 people were imprisoned in a church and later murdered. So do you have, Commissioner, any news on that? Are we planning to do anything about this, especially when it comes to Christianophobia? Because I would like to mention it as a broader problem, because actually Christians are the minority that is most persecuted across the world. In 2020, number of such incidents increased up to 300 million people concerned, 50% more attacks on churches, also 4.5 thousand Christians were murdered, and this number is also on the rise. So what are you intending to do when it comes to Christianophobia, and what measures are you going to take as Commission?
Thank you, Mr. Yaki. And now for 1 minute, Ms. Kruk.
Panie Przewodniczący.
President, Ethiopia is being ravaged by a civil war, and we keep getting disturbing news about serious violations of human rights. We fear for the civil population deprived of any access to humanitarian aid. A British weekly, Church Times, has written about a massacre of Christians, allegedly 750 of them, in Tigray, in front of a temple that is owned by Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Allegedly, the perpetrators come from the ranks of government army and the Amhar militias. If that information is confirmed, that means there was a case of war crime or genocide, something that hasn't ever happened in Ethiopia until now. Moreover, it would be contrary to a long-standing Ethiopian tradition of tolerance shown to different religions and ethnicities. So let me ask the Commission, have you verified that information? Have you demanded the access of independent observers and journalists to the region? And what kind of actions did you undertake in order to de-escalate that conflict and solve it by diplomatic means? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crook. And finally, now Commissioner Urpilainen on behalf of the Commission.
Dear President, dear colleagues, thank you for this discussion and debate. From my perspective, the message from this House is loud and clear. The world cannot turn a blind eye to the dramatic events in Ethiopia. And I also want to remind you that the EU has not been silent, and we have taken many actions. Firstly, as I already told you in my introduction, we decided to postpone the disbursement of 3 budget support payments. The total amount of that is 88.5 million euros. Secondly, as I described, we have supported the refugees and IDPs and host communities through the implementation of our programmes. And in addition to that, we also created PSNP programme, which amounts 50 million euros in order to support the poorest food insecure households. And as I told you, we also decided to give additional support to Sudan and Sudanese government because they are hosting at the moment a huge number of Ethiopian refugees. And fourthly, of course, we believe in political dialogue. We are politicians. We understand that even though we have a different kind of opinions and disagreements, we need to have a dialogue. And that's why we mandated the Foreign Minister of Finland, Pekka Haavisto, to make a mission to Ethiopia and have a dialogue with the Prime Minister Abiy, but also with the government. It was asked by the MEPs, but what is the EU doing to help? Concrete examples. So just to give you a couple of those examples, the EU funded humanitarian action in Ethiopia focuses on addressing the most urgent humanitarian needs. Last year, in 2020, the EU provided over 63 million euros to humanitarian projects in Ethiopia, including 18.18 million euros for the Tigray crisis and its spillover effects in other regions of Ethiopia, as well as 6 million euros additional funding for the Ethiopian refugees in Sudan. With the additional funding allocated for the Tigray crisis, the Commission's humanitarian partners, so United Nations, NGOs and Red Cross, for instance, are notably enhancing their emergency response capacity with the focus on health, shelter and non-food items, nutrition and protection sectors. And particular attention is given to IDPs and Eritrean refugees. In parallel, the EU is monitoring, and this is the important part, we are monitoring very closely the situation, notably through the humanitarian aid partners and through a dedicated field mission. And another mission will be conducted with Denmark, Sweden and Czech Republic at technical level this week. So since the start of the conflict, the EU has been at the forefront of humanitarian advocacy and has been praised for its principled stance on the Tigray crisis. Well, what shall we do now? The EU will definitely continue to act on its concerns by calling for an end to the conflict. That's the most important, to end the conflict. We are also urging for access for humanitarian actors to be guaranteed. We are protecting refugees and internally displaced persons and supporting the work of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission in its investigations on allegations of violence and abuses of human rights and violations of international law. And my last point is, and I think it was also mentioned by some of the MEP, that of course if we want to leverage, we need to be able to work as a team. We need to be able to act as a team. And of course it means that we need to be able to work together, the Commission, the Parliament, but also the Council, the Member States. And that's not enough. We also need to engage with the international community. For instance, with Switzerland, with the United Kingdom, with the US new administration, and with the other international organisations. And convey a message of unity and the importance to urgently engage in an inclusive dialogue with the Ethiopian government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Urpilainen. That brings us to the end of that debate.